Canada is no longer watching global events from a safe distance. It is quietly stepped into a new reality where old assumptions no longer apply. The real shock for Ottawa was not Venezuela itself, but the realization that the rules Canada trusted for decades may no longer protect anyone. What unsettled Canadian officials most was not chaos, but clarity. A U.S. president openly redefining power, sovereignty, and legitimacy in a way that makes every neighbor rethink its own future. For years, Canada viewed Latin America as important yet distant, strategically relevant but not existential. That perception collapsed the moment Donald Trump escalated U.S. actions toward Venezuela and framed them not as temporary pressure or diplomacy, but as a demonstration of dominance. When he spoke publicly, the language mattered more than the policy. There was little mention of international law, collective decision-making, or democratic consent. Instead, the message revolved around control, influence, and entitlement within a so-called sphere of power. To Canadian policymakers, this was not routine rhetoric. It sounded like history repeating itself. Trump invoked ideas closely tied to the Monroe Doctrine, a doctrine many believed had been buried by modern international norms. But in that moment, Ottawa realized something uncomfortable. Doctrines do not disappear, they wait. When Trump spoke about reasserting unquestioned American dominance in the Western Hemisphere, Canada heard a signal, not a slogan. Canada's concern was never limited to Venezuela. It was about precedent. If sovereignty can be overridden somewhere else through strength alone, then sovereignty becomes conditional everywhere. Canada, a resource-rich democracy sharing the world's longest undefended border with the United States, cannot afford to treat such thinking as abstract. When borders are reframed as negotiable and nations as assets, proximity matters. What changed Canada's posture was not fear, but recognition. Canadian analysts now treat repeated expansionist language the same way they treat military exercises or economic coercion, as indicators of intent. Jokes about annexation, once dismissed as provocation or theater, are no longer ignored. History shows that sovereignty is rarely lost overnight. It erodes through normalization, intimidation, and silence. Canada has chosen not to be silent. Ottawa's response has been deliberate and measured. There are no dramatic speeches or public threats. Instead, Canada is reassessing military dependencies, supply chains, and strategic assumptions that once felt permanent. Lessons from modern conflicts, especially Ukraine, are being studied closely. Civilian resilience, rapid mobilization, drones, and asymmetric defense are no longer theoretical discussions, but practical considerations. At the same time, Canada is strengthening what Trump openly dismisses: alliances. Coordination with European partners, deeper NATO cooperation, and renewed commitment to multilateral institutions form the backbone of Canada's strategy. Ottawa understands a reality Trump rejects. Power exercised alone burns out quickly, while power rooted in legitimacy endures. Canada is not preparing for conflict, it is preparing to avoid vulnerability. The distinction matters. This is not panic, and it is not provocation. It is realism shaped by history. When leaders begin speaking the language of domination, the nations that survive are those that prepare early, quietly, and collectively. Canada believes Donald Trump, and that belief has changed everything. Canada's recalibration did not happen overnight. It unfolded through closed-door briefings, intelligence reviews, and uncomfortable questions that had not been seriously asked in generations. What if restraint can no longer be assumed? What if proximity is a liability rather than a guarantee of safety? These questions now shape Canadian strategic thinking in ways unseen since the Cold War. For decades, Canada benefited from a predictable United States, sometimes difficult, often dominant, but broadly committed to rules, alliances, and mutual restraint. That framework allowed Canada to invest more in diplomacy than deterrence, more in trade than defense. But when a U.S. president openly dismisses limits on power and reframes sovereignty as negotiable, predictability collapses. From Ottawa's perspective, unpredictability is not just destabilizing, it is dangerous. This is why Canada's response has focused on resilience rather than rhetoric. Government planners are examining how economic pressure could be weaponized, how trade dependencies might be exploited, and how political narratives could be used to divide public opinion. The concern is not invasion tomorrow, but leverage over time. Modern power rarely announces itself with tanks. It arrives through influence, dependency, and coercion disguised as necessity. Canada is also rethinking deterrence in a modern context. Traditional military strength still matters, but so does the ability to function under pressure. Energy independence, domestic manufacturing capacity, secure digital infrastructure, and food security are now national security issues. The lesson drawn from recent global conflicts is simple. Countries that endure are those that can keep society functioning when external pressure mounts. At the same time, Canada is investing politically where it believes strength actually multiplies through collective action. While Trump frames alliances as burdens, Canada sees them as force multipliers. Deepening ties with Europe is not symbolic, it is strategic. Coordinating policy with democracies that still prioritize international law creates friction against unilateral power plays. It raises costs, slows escalation, and preserves space for diplomacy. Importantly, Canada is not positioning itself as anti-American. The distinction matters. Canada is responding to a specific worldview, not a population or a permanent reality. Ottawa understands that American politics shifts, sometimes dramatically, but it also understands that damage done to norms can outlast any single presidency. Once certain ideas are normalized, once domination replaces consent as acceptable language, putting that genie back in the bottle is difficult. This is why Canadian officials emphasize calm firmness. There is no appetite for public confrontation, but there is zero tolerance for erosion of sovereignty. The message is steady and unambiguous. Cooperation will always be welcomed. Coercion never will. Canada will engage, but it will not submit. It will coordinate, but it will not compromise its independence. Publicly, much of this remains understated. Privately, the seriousness is unmistakable. Canada is preparing not because conflict is inevitable, but because vulnerability is unacceptable. History favors nations that adapt early, not those that cling to comfort. Silence and denial are luxuries Canada believes it can no longer afford. In the end, Canada's shift is rooted in one hard lesson. When leaders speak the language of domination, it is not a performance, it is a preview, and Canada has decided that whatever the future holds, it will meet it prepared, aligned, and unyielding. True North remains not just a direction, but a principle, strong, free, and non-negotiable. As this chapter comes to a close, one thing is clear. Canada has crossed a psychological threshold. This is no longer about speculation, soundbites, or political drama. It is about awareness. Canada has recognized that the international environment it once trusted is changing, and with that recognition comes responsibility. Not to escalate, not to provoke, but to be ready, grounded, and clear-eyed. Canada's strength has never been loudness. It has been consistency. While others rely on intimidation or spectacle, Canada relies on preparation, legitimacy, and collective resolve. That is why this moment matters. History shows that nations which endure are not always the most powerful, but the most adaptive. Canada is adapting, not out of fear, but out of respect for reality. What makes this moment even more significant is the role of informed citizens. A country's resilience is not built only in government offices or military planning rooms. It is built in public understanding. Viewers who engage seriously with global issues, who question narratives instead of consuming them blindly, are part of that resilience. An informed audience is not a passive one. It is a safeguard against manipulation, normalization, and silence. That is why discussions like this matter, not because they offer easy answers, but because they encourage awareness. Canada's message to the world is simple. Sovereignty is not negotiable, alliances matter, and history will not be ignored. Strength does not come from domination. It comes from legitimacy and shared purpose, and Canada intends to remain on the right side of that history. Before we wrap up, it's important to recognize you, the viewers. If you've stayed with this analysis, it shows something powerful. You care about context, not just headlines. You value depth over noise. In a time when outrage travels faster than understanding, that matters more than ever. Your attention, your curiosity, and your willingness to engage thoughtfully are what keep serious conversations alive. Thank you for being part of that. Thank you for watching, for thinking critically, and for refusing to accept oversimplified narratives. Independent, informed audiences are the backbone of meaningful discourse, and your support makes this work possible. If you found this breakdown valuable, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Subscribing isn't just about notifications, it's about supporting content that prioritizes analysis over theatrics and substance over slogans. Stay connected so we can continue unpacking the stories that shape our world. Now, before you go, we'd love to hear from you in the comments. Do you think Canada's response is proportionate to the risks it perceives? Has international politics entered a phase where old rules no longer apply? Are alliances still the strongest defense against unilateral power, or are nations ultimately on their own? And most importantly, how should countries balance preparation with restraint in an unpredictable world? Share your thoughts below. Your perspective adds to the conversation, and respectful debate strengthens understanding. Thank you for watching. Stay informed, stay engaged, and we'll see you in the next one.